He was Hollywood's golden boy, the youngest actor to ever receive an Oscar nomination at the time. Brandon DeWilde had a future so bright, the world thought nothing could dim it. Then came Paul Newman, the blue-eyed icon, charismatic, magnetic, larger than life. What happened next between these two men has long been whispered about in hushed tones, until now. Do you believe Hollywood still hides its biggest secrets today? Comment 1 for yes, or 0 for no below. Because the relationship between Brandon DeWilde and Paul Newman was far shocking and deeper than anyone ever imagined. How Brandon DeWilde tried to seduce Paul Newman. Two men, each extraordinary in his own way, came into contact with one another at a moment that was fraught with both admiration and unspoken desire. This occurred in the golden haze of Hollywood in the early 1960s, when image was everything and secrets were kept behind the velvet curtains of studio offices. Paul Newman, a rising icon of effortless cool, who carried the rebel torch passed down from James Dean and Marlon Brando, was one of the individuals who embodied the concept of American masculinity. He was known for his blue eyes and his sense of style. Brandon DeWilde, the child actor who had tormented American viewers as the somber, wide-eyed Joey in Shane, as well as a young man who had developed into a startlingly sensitive, contemplative young man with creative yearnings and a restless spirit, was the other individual. DeWilde had changed significantly by the time he was in his early 20s. He was no longer the lad from the grassland with the unkempt hair. He had embarked on more mature parts, the most notable of which was in the film HUD, 1963, in which he appeared with Newman himself. The chemistry between the two of them in real life was just as complicated as the ones they performed on screen. Brandon, who was also emotionally sensitive and soft-spoken, looked up to Newman with a respect that went beyond simple admiration for his professional accomplishments. Paul's ability and the aura of a movie star were not the only things that struck him. He was completely enthralled by him. DeWilde was able to fire something within himself that he had never really accepted before. This was something that was kindled by Newman's rough confidence, which was a blend of warmth and aloofness. There was a perceptible energy between them on stage. At that time, Newman was in his late 30s when he saw Brandon's attention. He observed how Brandon stayed between shots, studying Paul with a calm devotion. Brandon's queries on acting, the philosophy of performance, and even marriage and loyalty were sometimes asked in a manner that appeared cryptic and elliptical. Brandon would ask him questions about these topics. Newman, ever the professional, would respond in a manner that was polite but elusive, maybe acknowledging the underlying current but opting not to upset the surface. Even to himself, Brandon may have been unable to pinpoint exactly what he was feeling. He was a young man who wore vulnerability like it was a second skin. He had grown up in the harsh limelight of child fame and had come of age during an era that was unfriendly to open demonstrations of queerness. His need for closeness, on the one hand, and his fear of exposure, on the other, were a familiar dilemma for many performers of the period who led double lives under the spotlight of stardom. He appeared to fluctuate between worlds as often as he did. Brandon allegedly invited Newman to a late-night gathering at his leased home off Sunset Boulevard during a break in filming, according to certain whispered rumors that have never been proven and have always been rejected. In spite of the fact that it was supposed to be a modest gathering, just a few people turned up. The evening finally came down to just the two of them, and it is unclear if this was intentional or simply a coincidence. Brandon played the guitar, and he had a soft, soulful touch. He gave Paul a drink, maybe bourbon, which Newman drank with the usual restraint that he always does. As was typical for Brandon, the conversation veered into philosophical territory, and he started talking about his feelings of isolation, stardom, and the aspects of himself that he believed he could never convey to others. There has been an unending amount of speculation on the moment that followed, which can be found in private memoirs, in half-told stories from industry insiders, and in the blank spaces of letters and interviews. Some others claim that Brandon hesitantly touched Paul's hand in an attempt to elicit a response from him. His bravery was said to have evaporated in the heated quiet that existed between them, according to some who believe he leaned in close, too near, before backing away. There is a possibility that Newman, who was cordial but forceful, guided the subject back to neutral ground in a gentle manner, opting for compassion rather than conflict. On the other hand, he had been married to Joanne Woodward for a very long time, and their marriage was one of the most stable in Hollywood, which is a rare occurrence. It's possible that Paul saw the event as little more than a passing remark in the context of a complex friendship. It continued to do so for Brandon, even though it was a very little danger. The emotional risk that he made was both freeing and damaging. In a world that only provided him with mirrors and masks, he had somehow managed to muster the courage to be genuine for a little while. And despite the fact that it did not result in the connection that he had hoped for, it confirmed something that was already there inside him. That want was not something to be ashamed of, and that longing could be beautiful even when it was not reciprocated. The truth buried beneath the mythology of old Hollywood. To add insult to injury, Brandon DeWilde's life was cut tragically short in 1972, when he was only 30 years old when he passed away in an automobile accident. Any reality that existed between him and Paul Newman passed away along with him, and it was buried behind the mystique of the old Hollywood culture. For whatever reason, Newman never made any public statements about the event, and it's possible that it never took place. It's also possible that it was just one of the numerous private and tender interactions that take place behind the scenes, and that are only remembered in parts, in sensations, and in silent moments of what could have been. The talented and captivating young actor Brandon DeWilde, who is best remembered for his work as a child star in films such as Shane, had a life that was simultaneously fiercely public and profoundly private. There were areas of his personal life that remained wrapped in secret, whispers, and whispered stories that only those who were close to him would have known about. This was despite the fact that he spent a significant portion of his career in the spotlight. His troubled connection with the great Paul Newman is one example of this type of narrative, which is the subject of only seldom open discussion. In the glitzy circles of Hollywood during the 1950s and 1960s, when image was everything and discretion was of the utmost importance, it was said that Brandon had a profound admiration for Paul Newman, and even more than that. Despite the fact that Newman was already a well-known celebrity and a symbol of cool elegance, the younger actor looked up to him as a role model and found him fascinating. Anecdotes and testimonials from others with knowledge of the situation suggest that Brandon did not only adore Paul from a distance. Through methods that were both subtle and purposeful, he made a concerted effort to capture his attention and affection. The charm, fragility, and young daring that Brandon displayed in his attempts to captivate Paul were like a delicate dance by Brandon. Through his piercing blue eyes, easy charm, and an air of untouchable coolness, he was aware that Newman was a guy who possessed a compelling presence. He was recognized for his charisma. On the other hand, Brandon was not your typical admirer due to his outstanding appearance and sensitive characteristics. Especially at a period when such topics were shrouded in caution, he was aware of the power of subtle gestures, the type of quiet signals that may express interest without overt assertions. He was aware of the power of subtle gestures. The talks that Brandon and Paul had together, which touched on topics such as their common enthusiasm for acting, art, and the intricacies of celebrity, were one of the ways that Brandon attempted to get Paul's attention. Brandon had a talent for making other people feel as though they were seen and heard, and when he was with Paul, he would pay close attention to what Newman had to say and engage in conversations that would allow him to be candid about his goals and disappointments. Brandon hoped that Paul would perceive the hidden invitation to closeness that was present in these moments of connection, which were tinged with an undertone of something more. When Brandon was in social situations, he would position himself in such a way that he was strategically close to Paul. He would offer Paul a kind grin or a short touch of the hand, moments that were ephemeral but packed with significance. Sometimes he would offer Paul discreet compliments that were camouflaged as casual remarks. These compliments may be praise for Paul's most recent film, appreciation for his charity endeavors, or modest notes about how Paul conducted himself with such effortless elegance. In a world where really being seen is a rare occurrence, each phrase was selected with great care as a means of conveying the message, "I see you." Brandon's seduction was not limited to verbal communication. It also involved physical presence. His attire was characterized by a restrained elegance, and he frequently wore garments that highlighted his young allure without appearing to make an excessive amount of effort. The manner in which he conducted himself conveyed an invitation that was not explicitly stated. It was characterized by an openness, a warmth, and a touch of vulnerability that drew people in. Brandon believed that emotional honesty was just as important as physical attractiveness when it came to the art of seduction. In spite of these attempts, there existed a tension that was a product of the times. Both men were employed in a field and society that required them to maintain silence on topics of such a personal nature. The constraints that were placed on individuals to keep up a public front frequently meant that any deeper relationship had to be kept concealed, secret, or a possibility that was whispered rather than being an open reality. When Brandon made his efforts, he did so with the awareness that the things he desired may never be totally accepted or publicly returned. This knowledge was laced with a bittersweet feeling. Nevertheless, those who were present during these times were able to perceive the underlying need that was driving Brandon's behavior. Brandon was a young man who was searching for something real in a society that was filled with artifice, and he was trying to bridge the gap between admiration and devotion, as well as between friendship and anything more. The question of whether or not Paul Newman truly understood or returned these subtle gestures is still open to conjecture. Nevertheless, what is certain is that Brandon DeWilde's efforts to connect were bold, emotional, and representative of his complex and passionate nature. In the end, this secret chapter of Brandon's life reflected the larger problems that many performers of his day faced. These actors were negotiating their wants within a culture of secrecy, yearning for true connection, and doing so while being watched by a society that was not yet ready to embrace their truths. As a painful reminder of the humanity that lies underneath the beauty and the silent struggles that are fought behind the scenes, Brandon's narrative, particularly his subtle attempts to attract and connect with Paul Newman, serves as a powerful example. How was his tragic death? Let's rewind. A star dimmed too soon. On July 6, 1972, the curtain fell for the last time on Brandon DeWilde. Not on a stage, but on a quiet road in Lakewood, Colorado. Just 30 years old, the actor who had once moved millions with a single, aching cry of "Shane! Shane! Come back!" met an end as sudden and brutal as it was undeserved. For those who had watched him grow from a wide-eyed child actor into a reflective, determined performer, the loss was nearly incomprehensible. DeWilde had been in Colorado to star in Butterflies Are Free, a play that, with its blend of humor, vulnerability, and emotional nuance, seemed tailor-made for his talents. The production at Denver's historic E. Leach Theater was a sign of where DeWilde wanted to go artistically, a pivot toward the emotional rigor and immediacy of live theater. Having earned acclaim in film and television throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Brandon was intent on reshaping his narrative, less as a fading child star and more as a seasoned actor of depth and substance. But fate had a crueler script in store. While traveling alone in a camper van, likely using the vehicle as both transportation and lodging during the show's run, DeWilde lost control, whether due to fatigue, mechanical failure, or an unseen hazard on the road. We may never know. What is certain is that the van veered violently, struck a guardrail, and slammed into a parked truck before flipping onto its side. The crash left Brandon trapped within the wreckage, his body broken but not yet lifeless. Emergency crews responded quickly, working with urgency to free him. Paramedics transported him to St. Anthony Hospital in Denver, ironically, a city he had come to for creative rebirth, not tragedy. There, doctors did all they could. But the list of injuries was staggering. A broken back, fractured neck, and a crushed leg. Injuries so severe that they left no room for recovery. Despite their best efforts, Brandon DeWilde succumbed to his injuries that same evening. News of his death spread quickly, and for those who knew him or had admired him from afar, it felt like the final act had arrived far too early. The final chapter. At precisely 7:20 p.m., on the evening of July 6, 1972, Brandon DeWilde was pronounced dead at St. Anthony Hospital in Denver. He was just 30 years old, a man still navigating the early years of adulthood, poised on the edge of a renewed career in theater and film. In many ways, he was only beginning to understand the full breadth of his talent, and the world was only beginning to see what he could truly offer beyond the image of the child star he had once been. News of his death sent a wave of shock through Hollywood and beyond. Fans, colleagues, and critics alike found it hard to accept that the boy they had watched grow up on screen, the wide-eyed Joey from Shane, the emotionally tormented characters in HUD and All Fall Down, was gone. His passing was not just a sudden end, but a heartbreaking interruption of a life that still seemed rich with possibility. In the days that followed, memorial tributes poured in from those who had worked with Brandon or had been touched by his performances. He had been more than just a Hollywood face. He had been a rare blend of vulnerability and intelligence, someone whose screen presence resonated with authenticity. Many in the industry had been quietly rooting for him, not just to make a comeback, but to evolve into the serious, respected actor they knew he could become. Initially, Brandon DeWilde was laid to rest in Hollywood, California, a symbolic gesture, placing him at the heart of the city that had witnessed both his meteoric rise and the challenges he faced as he transitioned into adulthood. It was there, under the bright lights and behind the studio gates, that his career had unfolded. Hollywood had celebrated him, profited from his precocious charm, and at times, left him to navigate fame alone. To be buried in its soil seemed to close the circle of his professional life. But time, grief, and the enduring love of his family brought a change to that decision. His parents, still reeling from the loss of their only son, found that Hollywood was too far, too distant, too public. They needed something closer, somewhere quieter, somewhere that felt more like home. And so, in a private, deeply emotional decision, Brandon's remains were later exhumed and moved across the country to Pine Lawn Memorial Park in Farmingdale, New York, nestled on Long Island. Not far from where the DeWilde family had lived, the cemetery offered a more peaceful, personal resting place. It was a setting less defined by celebrity and more grounded in family, memory, and intimacy. For Brandon's parents, the reburial brought a small measure of comfort. Here, they could visit him as often as they liked. They could tend to his grave not as fans or members of a viewing public, but as grieving parents trying to stay connected to the boy they had raised, the boy who had once memorized lines in their living room, who had played with toy cars in the driveway before being whisked off to rehearsals and interviews. It was a deeply human decision, rooted in love rather than legacy. Brandon DeWilde's death was a devastating personal loss for those closest to him, but it also echoed far beyond the walls of his home. For American cinema and television, it marked the premature end of a performer whose sensitivity and depth had been nearly unparalleled for someone so young. From his earliest roles, Brandon had shown a remarkable ability to tap into emotions that most adult actors struggled to convey. His vulnerability wasn't acted, it was lived. It radiated from his eyes, his voice, his stillness on screen. Critics had often said he didn't perform a role so much as inhabit it. And that's what made his absence feel so profound. He hadn't just been promising, he had already delivered, and he was poised to do even more. The car accident in Colorado didn't merely stop a career. It silenced a voice that had so much more to say. The world will never know what Brandon DeWilde might have achieved had he lived. Whether he would have become a towering figure in theater, a revered character actor in Hollywood, or perhaps even walked away from show business altogether to pursue a quieter life is impossible to say. What remains is the work he left behind. Fragments of a life lived at full intensity, even in its brevity, and the memory of a young man who had seen the spotlight early, struggled with its shadow, and was just beginning to find his own way back into the light. In Farmingdale, beneath the grass and headstones of Pine Lawn Memorial Park, Brandon now rests, not in the glittering realm of stars, but in the gentle embrace of home. It is a quieter tribute, but perhaps the truest one, for in the end, he was not only an actor or a public figure, he was a son, a father, a friend, and a man whose inner world was as rich and complex as any role he ever played. And while the cameras may have stopped rolling, Brandon DeWilde's presence endures, in film, in memory, and in the hearts of those who still wonder what might have been. Everything comes to a tragic end. But before that, he had lived lively days. The boy who spoke with his eyes. Andre Brandon DeWilde entered the world already surrounded by the rhythm of backstage life. His parents, Frederick A. Fritz DeWilde and Eugenia Wilson DeWilde, were not merely casual participants in the arts, they were steeped in it. His father, a respected Broadway production stage manager and occasional actor, and his mother, a part-time stage actress, passed on to Brandon more than just a genetic legacy. They gave him a home filled with scripts, costumes, and stories told in stage whispers. From his earliest days, Brandon was a child raised on theater dust and playbills. When the family moved to Baldwin, Long Island, his exposure to the performing arts didn't wane. It flourished. His household wasn't one that discouraged imagination or dramatic flair. Instead, it encouraged it. That support would prove to be foundational for a boy whose emotional sensitivity and expressive eyes would one day captivate the world. At just 7 years old, Brandon stepped onto the Broadway stage in Carson McCullers' hauntingly intimate drama, The Member of the Wedding, cast as John Henry West, a lonely, Inquisitive boy clinging to his older cousin's impending wedding, Brandon delivered a performance that left critics in awe. He didn't act like a child. He felt like one. Authentic, vulnerable, wide-eyed. For this, he earned the Donaldson Award, becoming the youngest actor ever to receive the prestigious honor. Hollywood took notice. In 1952, Fred Zinnemann directed a film version of The Member of the Wedding, and Brandon was invited to reprise his role. He did so with the same emotional clarity and truthfulness that had captivated Broadway, winning a Golden Globe Award for Most Promising Newcomer. This was not merely a child acting. It was a child communicating, as if channeling something far older and wiser than his years. But it was in 1953 that Brandon DeWilde would etch his name permanently into the collective memory of American cinema. Cast as Joey Starrett in George Stevens' elegiac Western Shane, Brandon gave the kind of performance that makes a film timeless. His character's innocent admiration of the mysterious gunslinger, played by Alan Ladd, resonated across generations. His final line, a desperate, tear-choked cry, "Shane, come back!" became one of the most iconic in movie history. For this role, at just 11 years old, Brandon was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. He was one of the youngest ever to receive such recognition at the time. The nomination marked not just the height of his early career, but also the enormous expectations that would come to define much of his adolescence and early adulthood. In the years following Shane, DeWilde sought to remain relevant as both a performer and a person. He turned to television, a growing medium that provided him new avenues for growth. From 1953 to 1954, he starred in Jamie, an ABC sitcom about an orphaned boy living with his grandfather. The show captured DeWilde's unique blend of sweetness and seriousness and proved that he could carry a series with warmth and charisma. He continued to guest star on some of the most acclaimed programs of the era: Wagon Train, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, The Loretta Young Show, and The Virginian. These appearances highlighted his ability to shift between genres, from family-friendly fare to darker, more suspenseful territory, without ever losing the natural honesty that had become his trademark. But growing up in the public eye is rarely kind. Like many child actors, Brandon faced the daunting task of evolving into an adult performer while millions watched. His voice changed. His face matured. The charm of boyhood gave way to the complications of young manhood. Yet unlike many of his peers, Brandon refused to coast on nostalgia. He dug deeper. In 1959, he starred in Blue Denim, a serious drama about teenage pregnancy and parental neglect, opposite Carol Lindley. The film was daring for its time, and Brandon's performance signaled his desire to confront difficult, contemporary themes. It was not enough for him to be seen. He wanted to be understood. That hunger for complexity led to some of the most impressive work of his career. In All Fall Down, 1962, he played the morally conflicted younger brother of a charismatic but cruel Warren Beatty. His portrayal of the quiet observer, unsure whether to protect or expose the darkness he sees in his sibling, felt almost autobiographical. There was always a sense in Brandon's performances that the characters he played were wrestling with something unspeakable just beneath the surface. Then came HUD in 1963, a film that cemented Brandon's place among serious dramatic actors. Starring alongside Paul Newman and Melvin Douglas, DeWilde portrayed Lonnie Bannon, a young man torn between the old-world integrity of his grandfather and the cynical hedonism of his uncle. Brandon's performance was tender and heartbreaking. He was the film's conscience, its moral center. Critics praised his work, and many believed he was on the cusp of a major renaissance as a leading man in a new generation of American film. But fame is a double-edged sword, and the pressures of early success can cast long shadows. While Brandon continued to act in both film and television throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, he was also quietly searching for roles, for purpose, and perhaps for the kind of personal peace that had always eluded him. Aside from acting, Brandon had an interest for music. He teamed with Graham Parsons, a friend and guitarist well known for his work with the Byrds and the Flying Burrito Brothers. Brandon wanted to pursue a career in music, and Parsons' band, the International Submarine Band, helped him with recording sessions. Although these musical ventures were not commercially successful, they demonstrated Brandon's diverse creative interests. Parsons later co-wrote the song In My Hour of Darkness with Emmylou Harris, with the first lyric honoring Brandon's untimely passing. Brandon DeWilde married twice throughout his brief but colorful life and had one son. His first wife was Susan Ma, a writer, whom he married in 1963. At the time, DeWilde was just 21 years old and already a well-known actor with a bright career, while Maga, as a writer, shared his artistic sensibility and enthusiasm for the arts. Their relationship began with mutual appreciation and a desire to create a life based on creative expression and emotional depth. They welcomed a son, Jesse DeWilde, into the world, which gave Brandon's life new meaning. Becoming a father was a huge milestone for DeWilde, and despite the responsibilities of his acting profession and the expectations that come with youthful celebrity, he remained committed to his duty as a parent. However, the pressures of keeping a marriage in the limelight, along with the inherent difficulties of two young people pursuing busy jobs, took its toll. Brandon and Susan divorced in 1969, 6 years after they were married. Although their relationship ended, they continued to co-parent Jesse and communicated through their son. Several years later, in the early 1970s, DeWilde rediscovered love with Janice Jarrow. Janice, a former flight attendant and aspiring actress, provided Brandon with a new feeling of camaraderie and stability at a time when he was looking for personal and professional rebirth. The couple's love swiftly progressed, and they married in April 1972. Brandon appeared to be genuinely pleased in the months following his marriage, with friends and family characterizing him as more focused and hopeful about the future. Unfortunately, their time as husband and wife would be heartbreakingly brief. Brandon DeWilde, 30, died in an automobile accident in Denver, Colorado, only 3 months after their wedding, on July 6, 1972. His premature death not only grieved his family, friends, and admirers, but also ended a fresh chapter in his personal life that had only recently begun. Despite the short duration of his second marriage, people close to him thought he had found a companion in Janice who genuinely understood and supported him. The unwritten chapters. A life that had been both blessed and burdened by early talent was suddenly, irrevocably gone. Brandon's death robbed the entertainment world of a rare kind of talent, one that had bloomed early, dimmed momentarily, but was readying for resurgence. His trajectory had always been unique, an Oscar-nominated actor at age 11, a Broadway veteran by his teens, and later, a quiet, introspective figure who was wary of the trappings of fame but deeply passionate about the craft. Friends and collaborators often described him as thoughtful and soft-spoken, with a quiet intensity that translated effortlessly to the screen. Yet beneath his gentle exterior, DeWilde had battled personal demons, moments of uncertainty, professional stagnation, and the haunting question all child stars eventually face. What happens when the world stops calling you a prodigy? His move into theater wasn't merely a career adjustment, it was a reclamation. Here was a young man confronting his past and reshaping his future on his own terms, eager to prove that his talent wasn't a childhood fluke, but a lasting force. Legacy of a life. Cut short. Brandon DeWilde's body of work, though not extensive in volume, was rich in depth. His performance in Shane remains a cultural touchstone, not just for his role in cinema history, but for the raw, emotional honesty he brought to the screen. His later roles in films like HUD and All Fall Down revealed a maturing actor, unafraid to embrace complexity and moral ambiguity. His sudden death lent his story a tragic poignancy that echoes that of other young stars who burned bright and vanished too soon. But unlike many of his contemporaries, DeWilde's demise was not the product of addiction or recklessness. It was a random, senseless accident that snatched him from a life he was finally beginning to rebuild. In the years since, he has been remembered not just for what he accomplished, but for what might have been. The roles he never got to play, the stages he never walked, the stories he never told. These silences speak volumes. After Brandon DeWilde died in a car accident, Paul Newman never spoke publicly about it. Not once. But those who knew him said something changed in Paul after Brandon's death. The sparkle dimmed. The laughter didn't come as easily. And when he was once asked about young actors he admired, he whispered Brandon's name and walked away, eyes misty, voice silent. Was it a friendship? A mentorship? A forbidden love? The truth may have died with them, but the story still lingers. What do you think happened between Brandon DeWilde and Paul Newman? Comment your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your perspective. Like this video if you believe in remembering the ones who were silenced, And subscribe for more Hollywood truths they tried to keep hidden.